Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, welcome to ANZ Blue Notes.
It's great to be with you.
I'd like to start the conversation by talking about the status quo with respect to cultural diversity in our senior leadership in public and private sector organisations. We don't have great statistics around that in Australia, with less than 10% of our senior leadership coming from non-European backgrounds. I'd like to hear from you around why in 2016 cultural diversity at a leadership level is important.
It's surprising at one level to see that cultural diversity in Australia isn't quite reflected yet in the senior leadership of our organisations, because we pride ourselves on being a multicultural society. We're a country where nearly half the population was either born overseas or has a parent who was born overseas, but yet none of this appears yet to be reflected in the leadership that we have of business organisations, the leadership we have in politics and government or in civil society. And that is a challenge for us to tackle, because if we're not making the most of our diversity, we're not making the most of our talents as a society. If we're serious about our multicultural character, then we should be celebrating our diversity not only in the form of food and festivals, we should also be harnessing that diversity of talent that we have. So welcoming cultural diversity not only in the lunchroom or the lobby of our organisations, but also having diversity in the corridors of power.
Doctor, one of the challenges I think as Australians who really want to give people the fair go have is even starting a conversation about racial diversity in the workplace, because sometimes it feels like you can't say anything right in that context. People feel scared of saying the wrong thing and offending someone. And as a result, my fear is that we just don't talk about it. So how do we address that in our day-to-day work? What's the right way to approach a conversation about racial diversity so that we don't offend other people, but so that we do have the conversation?
Well, you're right to say that it's important to have the conversation, and you're also right to say that there are obstacles to that. It really helps to think about these issues first and reflect on them, so that when the opportunity does arise, you have a certain confidence in how you're going to conduct that chat or that conversation. I'll give you an example. I fly a lot in this job, and I will frequently encounter flight attendants at the boarding gate who will struggle with my surname, which is long and polysyllabic, and I get a number of responses. Some flight attendants will attempt to pronounce the name, and some of them will get it close to right or absolutely right. Others will pause and ask me how to pronounce the name before making an attempt, and then others won't even try at all. Now, I suspect that those who aren't trying at all to pronounce my name could well be doing so because they're afraid of getting it wrong. But in fact, the signal that can send is not necessarily a positive one, because I'd much prefer it for people to try and pronounce my name and get it wrong, or at least ask me how it's pronounced. And that, I think, is a good illustration. And sometimes the best way of broaching a subject is simply to ask someone whether they're happy to talk about something or whether you can ask a question. Think about it, and then in a spirit of goodwill and in good faith, have that conversation, because I suspect that the other person on the other end of the conversation is going to be more generous than what you might think, and people will accept that mistakes can be made or that things may not come out the right way, but it's the attitude with which you do something that usually matters more. So if you have that goodwill, if you have that generosity, then I think you can assume that it will be reciprocated most of the time.
So I guess that leads to my final question, which is around how do we implement meaningful change? You've recently published a paper on that, but I'd really like to hear your views in terms of doing things that tangibly take the conversation forward and allow people better access to workplace diversity in our organisations here in Australia.
Action can start very simply through a conversation, through listening to people's experience, to listening to people's perspective and contributions. Quite often we can go about our business and think that there's a certain way of doing things. If we are able to take the time and think about doing things in a slightly different way, or asking a contribution from someone who we may not typically ask a contribution from, or pausing to question some of our assumptions, that can aid in us valuing diversity better.
Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Tim Soutphommasane.
Thanks for the conversation.